Kevin, one of the more interesting areas in the model is how the HR teams in general could evolve and develop a relationship with their business partners, similar to how CHROs like you and Carol have built with your CEOs. And our customers are talking to us about this. Willem Genesee, who you know well and heads up our coaching practice, speaks about cobbler's children syndrome, that HR folks spend a great deal of time and energy ensuring that executives keep building and scaling their leadership skills, but may not be investing enough in themselves. So challenge me a little on this, and I know it sounds somewhat selfish from Crenshaw, but why wouldn't HR executives invest in an experienced coach and advisor to help build their own leadership and influence skills to be even more effective business partners?
It's hard to challenge on something I think I agree with. First off, Willem is such a wise guy. I mean, he really is. I've had the fortune of knowing him for pretty close to 20 years, and his insights are extraordinary. And so I'm not surprised that you quote him on something like this. And Cobbler's Kids, I think, is a fair point. Comes from a good place. I think most of us believe that we're principally here to sort of focus on the strength and the progress of the executives or the teams that we're working with, right? Nothing wrong with that. And we put a lot of our energy into doing something like that. And we don't put as much energy or maybe any energy into doing that for ourselves. So for starters, if it's implied in your question, I think it's a great idea for HR to invest more in itself. I personally benefited enormously from external advisors. Now, I've had a lot of mentors that I sort of got for free, but I've had paid advisors who are absolutely essential to whatever success I've been able to enjoy. They have pushed me, argued with me, got me out of my own way, challenged me, and they've made me better. So I would be here, first of all, to endorse. I'm a personal fan of the subject, and I've used it and I've paid for it. And I think more of that should happen. Good way to think about it is maybe we had to stop thinking about it as a cost, which a lot of us do. You've only got so much of a budget, put that budget toward other places first, right? Maybe your general managers, your P&L leads or something like that. We have to think about it like you framed the question. It's an investment. It's not a cost, it's an investment. And it's related to this world-class CHRO model. I mean, to me, the marriage of this model and the coaching that you're talking about would be perfect, because the coach could be moving you toward a particular outcome like the model. And I'm not sure that many people can just sort of simply read the model and become it, right? I think they need some help with it. So an external advisor, an external coach could absolutely close those gaps, take a look at the model and decide where are the gaps, and then what can we do together to close some of those gaps.
Some of the work that you and Carol refer to having the HR function and the people in HR become more familiar with the business models that they're involved in. Now, we've known each other for some time, and one of the things I love about the HR folks at Pepsi is they really understood the business model, because a lot of them started in the plant. So they saw how the product was manufactured, loaded, distributed, knew the contracts of the unions. How do you translate that? Or what's the model to teach or to have the HR folks experience the business model, know how the money flows and how the enterprise succeeds?
I'll tell you a story that I don't think I've ever told you before. When I crossed over from Pepsi to American Express, I had a fantastic 14-year run at Amex that I wouldn't trade for anything. But the beginning stages, they were not smooth. And I remember in my onboarding, let's call it the first 2 months I was there, I would say most of the executives at American Express looked at me just like you described, but maybe with a negative taint. They were looking at, what does this guy who grew up with or comes to us from labor unions, gritty manufacturing plants, trucking systems, distribution, bottling plants, very gritty work, way down from the sort of the highfalutin financial services world that Amex occupied. So I was asked to spend some time with one of the P&L leaders in the early part of my onboarding, and I'm ready for this conversation. And I said to him, tell me a little bit about your business. And Bill, he sniffed the air And it's personified arrogance. He looked at me and he said, well, to be honest with you, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And I looked at him in the eye and I said, well, why don't you start with how you make money? And his entire attitude instantly changed. Oh, well, and he starts running down. He had 3 business lines that he ran, and he took me through basically the income statement of each of those 3 businesses. And we ended up becoming good friends. You know, from that rough start, it actually didn't take very long at all to where we were having breakfast together, you know, once a month and this sort of thing. The moral of the story to me is there's only one income statement. There's only one balance sheet. I mean, you can have different industries, different businesses. They can behave differently as you kind of move from the top line to the bottom line. But my advice to HR people all over the place, including here at GE, is, you know, do you really understand how the businesses that you work with make money? And if you align your strategies and your efforts and your priorities behind helping those general managers do that better or do that more frequently, you are going to be more relevant, you're going to be more useful, and you're going to make a bigger difference. It's easy if you can walk a plant and jump on a truck and talk to frontliners. There's no question that sort of going to Gemba, as we talk about it here in GE's lean environment, that's where all the truth lives. It lives at the front line, closest to your customer. So you certainly ought to spend a good bit of time there to check your own instincts. But it can be done. I'm here to tell you it can be done in a blue collar environment, a white collar environment, whatever color you might be wearing. And it's just as important now as it was 30 years ago, maybe more.
It seems that it could be a lot easier in a manufacturing environment than it is in a service environment. But I think you're right. If it starts with how the money flows, how do we make money, probably elicits an easier understanding or a better, easier explanation for somebody to adopt.
Well, that's how you get it, I would say, from the top down. But we also, and you've been a fan of this for a long time as well, the customer, right? I mean, some of your way back early days were spent in sales and in and around customers.
You mean like selling toothpaste on the streets of New York?
I do that. I do mean that, and getting sort of thrown out of, every third account you went into by trying to sell too much. But what all that taught you, I think, it injected in you was sort of a respect for the customer that, as long as I've known you, has never wavered, right? You've always thought about the customer in a very, very special way. The time you spend with the front line, even in a service organization, those are the folks closest to the customer. And we can all get a blind spot here and there. We can all sort of stay too far away from the customer. And so another thing that HR or anybody can do, by spending time with the front line, you actually see where your customer is going to be most likely to be really thrilled or really disappointed. And the value of those insights and how you feed that back into the system is additive to me to the sort of whole top line income statement, balance sheet kind of view you gotta have. I think great HR is going to do a little bit of both.
Are you positive about folks adopting the model itself in terms of the leadership today, being able to adopt it? Essentially, how do you feel about overall the CHRO environment today?
One of the things that I think about this model is we were trying to get enough structure to be helpful, but not so all-encompassing that it felt like a straitjacket. Because I think that, for example, when I look at the model, I might use the model differently in 2024 than I did in 2022. It's sort of like a buffet. And you might say, I'm going to go heavy on these 2 columns and light on these 2 columns because of the context I'm in right now. And that context can shift. So one of the things I think that makes it sustainable and makes it pretty universally appealing is you can take from it what you feel like you need. One of my favorite use cases is, let's say there's a change between the CEO and the CHRO. Carol Surface, my colleague here who co-led this with me, Carol just accepted the head of HR position at Apple. She was at Medtronic when we did this work. And just a couple of weeks ago, she's going to work for Tim Cook at Apple. So I imagine that Carol is going to take this document in to sit down with Tim, and they're going to frankly kind of negotiate what part of this model makes the most sense for Apple in the context that they're in right now. In the course of doing that, she's going to educate Tim, maybe in terms of how to think about using the head of HR. Tim's going to educate Carol in terms of sort of what Apple might need more of versus less of. And basically, they have a contracting session around the model like this. So that's my favorite use case. As you know, Bill, the life cycle of a CEO seems to be getting shorter rather than longer. You work with a lot of them, and you know this to be true. So the odds that one of the two positions are going to change is pretty high. So the CHRO might hang around and get a different CEO. The CEO might hang around and get a different CHRO. So a model like this can really help speed up the partnership and sort of get to a good place in a hurry. I think we've struck a nice balance between loose and tight enough to give structure, not so tight that it feels confining or programmatic, which I think would kill it.
Are there what counts factors that when you're interviewing a person for a senior HR role, what do you think about in terms of what counts factors or competencies?
Yeah. So I will use this model as an interview guide. And I am a believer that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So instead of asking people, tell me what you think you would do in talent management if you joined us here at GE, my question will be, so you're working at XYZ company and right now, tell me what you have done and tell me what outcomes you drove in the area of driving enterprise change. Tell me a story of when you drove enterprise change against all odds, when it was unlikely that you were going to succeed, and tell me how you fought through that and the difference that you made. Because I believe that that will tell me a lot about what that person will bring to our context going forward. So that's generally how I use the model in interviewing. But the competency, I'm going to actually maybe twist your word. If I only had one quality to look for in HR, only one, it would be courage. Because you are often asked to do something that somebody doesn't want to do. You're often the social conscience of the organization. You're often standing between what's popular and what's right. You're sometimes defending things that people don't understand. So your ability to kind of stand strong and not do it for your ego, but to constantly say, this is what's best for the organization, is the single most valuable skill to me in HR. And by the way, that's true for heads of HR, heads of total rewards, heads of talent. You go right through the org chart of most HR companies. And I would say courage is a far bigger deal than many people give it credit for.
When you look at senior talent and the needs that exist today, what needs need to be addressed and what keeps you up at night?
There might be a little bit of recency bias in my answer to this question, because just over the last 2 days, I went to a big global conference with heads of HR. So I'm kind of coming fresh off of a meeting that happens once a year that I haven't been able to join, by the way, since before the pandemic. So this was a little bit of a reunion and a good chance to plug in with a lot of people who I respect greatly, peers, and I like them and I learn from them. We spent a lot of time talking about the future of work, Bill, at this meeting, which is a very big subject. It could be defined 100 different ways. The thing that kept cycling back to me, there were two themes that just kept coming back to me. One of them is the importance of frontline leadership, not senior leadership, frontline leadership. I worked for a guy one time who told me, Kevin, and this is 30 years ago, Kevin, that's the key to everything. It's the key to whether you're going to get organized with a third party like a labor union. It's the key to whether you're going to have attrition problems. It's the key to whether you're going to have, they probably didn't use the word engagement back then, but sort of a satisfied workforce. The quality of the frontline leader, the effect they have on the largest part of your organization, where the pyramid gets the widest, is huge. Now, I've known that for 30 years. Am I currently investing in that? I am not. Why? No good answer to that. And so in this workforce that's got a Generation Z component in it, you asked me what keeps me up at night. You and I have always worked in a place where there's a couple generations kicking around at any point in time in the company, right? So that's not new. But now, like you said, there are 4 of them at least that are still here. And I have never seen the gulf as wide between, let's call it a boomer like me, and there's still a few boomers kind of hanging on to power in the senior parts of organizations, and the Gen Z population, like our post-college age children might be. There's a huge gap between how those two groups think about work, think about learning, think about mentorship, think about loyalty, think about expectations, a huge gap. And I am concerned about that because the net effect of it is if Generation Z is not getting what it needs or wants, they have the means, the transparency, the technology, and the risk appetite to simply change channels. Boom. They will not give that company too many more opportunities to get it right. They'll just move, and they'll move again, and they'll move again, and they'll move again. And I think they will stunt their growth by doing that. They will not sort of play through the difficulty that gives you the resilience and the agility that we talked about a few minutes ago. And companies will just be sort of a revolving door of talent that will hurt its competitiveness, I think. So I really think we've got to get this thing right. And we've got to find a way to aim our value proposition in a different way to this generation that's coming up the line. Because it's always, in any company, it's always been the source of energy, the source of innovation, source of possibilities, even when you and I were younger men, right? I just feel like there's a gulf between the two that I've never seen quite as wide. And I do worry about that.
Let me build on that a little bit. Isn't it true, though, given all the things you described, that some of the key elements that Gen Z or millennials want is to be mentored, developed, and have leadership? And sometimes I do default to, well, they want more work-life balance, which is probably true than we had. They want to work virtually. And sometimes I think I forget about the fact that at the heart of it, though, part of longevity in their careers with a company or loyalty to the company is how their leader respects them and works with them and develops them.
Well, all I can do is like full-throated agreement with you, Bill. And it's why I said a minute ago, this frontline leadership is so important, because I still believe that old statement that people join companies and they leave leaders. Yeah. And the question we all have to ask ourselves is, what is the experience? What is the leadership experience that Gen Zer is getting right now? And you're exactly right. It has little to do with working from home or hybrid or work-life balance. I think there needs to be a different word than engagement. It has to do with what is that leader doing to create an environment where that person believes they are bringing all of themselves to work and whatever they're willing to give, which is a lot, by the way, just as much as you and I gave when we were that age, but where they feel like that is appreciated, rewarded, and respected the same way that I think maybe we did. Back then, when we were growing up, there were smaller spans of control. So the leaders we worked for had probably a third as many people to worry about as today's leader does. They were trained in classic leadership development programs that have largely gone by the wayside. So the chance that you or I had a pretty good leader is higher, or was higher than it is today, right? They were classically trained. And right now, I think it's sort of trial by fire. And we are experimenting on this Generation Z group, and they know it. And the stories that they tell about poor leadership practices are many. And that's what needs to change.
You know, I always think that a disruption that's coming that may not be as anticipated is the lack of leadership experience that a Gen Z or millennial has, because they probably haven't experienced really strong leaders, maybe not as many weak leaders, but understanding what a leader should be doing or not. And today, I'm not sure they're getting that kind of education and experience that gets them ready to assume more responsibilities.
I got in early this morning and I went over my notes from this conference I told you about. I had 8 takeaways. That was number 7. What you just said was number 7. My way of saying it was, what sort of leaders will Gen Z be, given what their experience has been or is being? And I'm not necessarily saying that's going to be bad, but it's a big question mark, because they're to some degree going to lead as they've been led, which I don't think is optimal. So totally with you on that.
Just want to be candid in terms of someone told you 30 years ago to focus on the front line. I think you're taking that from maybe Craig Weatherup and Right Side Up at Pepsi, which I actually, Kevin, have carried through, which is one of the key elements is frontline focus, right? Because they're closest to the customer. And if you get that right, the business model normally works better.
Well, if we're naming names, Craig Weatherup, who was who I knew as the CEO and chairman of the Pepsi Bottling Group when we created it back in 1998, 1999. He certainly was a pioneer of that right side up thinking, and that definitely informed my thoughts. But there was another guy, John Bronson, who, when I was being promoted and asked to move into New Jersey, which was a pretty tough environment for Pepsi at the time, low margins, a tough retail trade, pretty contentious labor relations. His last words to me before he sent me off to New Jersey, he said, every HR person before you that's gone to New Jersey goes down there and thinking it's about changing the labor relations union environment there. He said, and if you do that, you will fail just as many of your predecessors have. He said, it's all about the front line. You ought to focus more on the district managers that are creating the reasons why employees feel like the union is their ally, not their leadership. And John was so right about that. So Craig set a context to think about the customer on top, right, and the respect for the front line. And John helped me think about that. And I'll always be grateful for that lesson. And I'm just a little bit embarrassed that, years go by and here I am in 2023 still trying to learn a lesson from 1991 or whatever it was.